I feel very honored tonight to be in such esteemed company, both with Stephen Lewis, the folks from Brampton who have been so welcoming, and to all of you. Thank you for caring about your city so much and coming out on a night like tonight, on a cold night, to hear about ideas to make it better. So I'm humbled and excited to be part of this series. I wanted to sort of situate myself in my context before I started sharing with you what I believe is some tips and tricks to advance an inclusive city. My story began when I was looking for a job after I finished my undergraduate degree at McGill University, having studied architecture and cities and really fascinated by the possibilities of both, not unlike all of you tonight. I had formed a working thesis when I left school that our human rights to food, water, and shelter for me extended to architecture, and that we didn't just have the right to space, but to safe, beautiful, dignified space. And I speculated then, and still believe today, that architecture has this immense power to let us know that we belong. And so often it does the opposite, feeling exclusionary, and sometimes falling short of what we feel like we deserve. So eager to explore my emerging thesis and fresh out of school, that our right to dignified space is all of ours to share, I set out into the world of architecture, asking esteemed architects, planners, and city building professionals questions about how they came to build trust with the communities their buildings live within. And I really wanted to understand how they understood people's lives so as to design in a way that helped local people thrive. And I was met with talks of surveys, public meetings, and consultations. And I wondered if I wasn't making myself perfectly clear. I wanted to know how we understood the fullness of someone's urban experience, their aspirations, their hopes, their fears for their families and their communities, and also those wonderful tangential stories that give us indicators of what makes civic life delightful for certain people. I was recently on a research project specifically focused on Toronto's waterfront, and when we talked to a young man about his favorite public space, he took us to a chair in a mall outside of a Cinnabon, where he liked to go read a book. He said, this is a perfect place in the city to go read a book. It smells good, it's warm, and the chair's always here. I believe that it's these things and our felt sense of the city, not just the things that we say in public meetings, that determine whether or not we're having a thriving urban experience. I realized that these kinds of answers, feelings, and reflections could only be gleaned through open and flowing conversation, not a set of structured questions, and very few engagement questions or engagement settings are set up for people to just talk. And for people to share their truth, there needs to be trust, which takes time, more time than is often allotted through typical engagement processes. I also recognize that those who I was talking to, these esteemed city builders, represented an entirely different demographic. The average age of a successful architect and city builder, for that matter, was 55, and predominantly white and male. I was none of those things, and if you can't tell, I'm still not. I realized then that I both needed to redefine who got to call themselves a city builder, so people like myself could find a place in influencing civic life. And I needed to build a process of human-centered urbanism that could create ongoing and sustained engagement, building trust over time and helping residents understand that their power extends well beyond participating in evening workshops and public meetings. So the work I do now helps organizations learn and large institutions learn how to listen, and has them confront their assumptions about how much they actually know about the people that they're trying to serve. Organizations so often will orient themselves around what's feasible, do we have the money, and what's viable, do we have the people to spend that money, and what's actually desirable to people becomes secondary. This is not because large organizations are bad or because they don't care. It's because sometimes we don't trust that the problems or challenges we hear from people are viable or feasible to solve for. In my years doing this work, I've learned that starting with people leads us to solutions that address the real wants, wishes, and needs of the public. They're more sustainable, and often they cost a lot less money. So I wanted to share with you tonight some experiences I've had using people power, leading with desirability, bringing visionary ideas for cities, organizations, and places to life, all predicated on how people engage after a plan or a decision has been put in place. I'm hoping to give you some tips and tricks to continue engaging with the process of Brampton 2040, but for them to really resonate, you need to know that you are all city builders and that your lived experience is all the credential you need to engage with the city. If we want Brampton to be inclusive, it means that we are consistently activating the space between institutions and infrastructure, and that has to be done by you, the community. You need to feel like you belong here, connected to your neighbors even when you disagree with them, and be tuned into your sense of agency. My friend David Crumby, who I think you met last week, often says, who was here last week actually? Hands up if you were here last week. Okay, so you got to see one of my favorites. He might have said this last week. He always says that you don't need training to be a citizen. And I believe you don't actually need to be training to be an engaged resident. You just need your truth and the ability to recognize and trust other people's truth. So knowing that, hands up for those in this room who would call themselves a city builder. Okay, not bad. Good showing. You're all city builders, spoiler alert. So here are a few things I wanted to just show you, tell you a few stories and give you a few ideas of how to bring Brampton 2040 into reality now that you have the vision. The things I'm going to share with you seem awfully simple, but they're very hard for people and large institutions to negotiate. So I ask you to bear with me as we go through them. So starting with people. So a few years ago, I was working with a team that was helping the federal government solve the challenge of onboarding seniors to the Old Age Security Program, a program that since its inception has had a material impact on reducing poverty in the aging population in Canada. It's a benefit program for all Canadians, yet 55% of the eligible people were not redeeming it. And the federal government had a hunch that creating a more streamlined digital experience of the program, creating a more sophisticated and user-friendly interface, might do the trick of increasing enrollment in the program. We asked them if before doing any digital improvements, we could go and spend time with seniors. If we could hang out with them in their daily lives, go with them to the community center for all the activities that they attend, talk to them about what aging was like over a meal, and get to know them. Maybe we could surface some real insights about why there was lagging enrollment in the program. When we went out and talked to seniors and social workers helping seniors, because they were a really important part of the ecosystem, and we discussed the experience of aging, we learned a few things. First, it's really embarrassing to age and feel like you need handouts from the government. Even when you realize you do, it's kind of hard to talk about money. Sometimes you don't fully realize that you needed that much money. So a lot of seniors we talked to said, you know, when I was working, $250,000 seemed like a lot of money, and then I got to retirement and it seemed like a really scary amount of money. And even if you have the money and don't want it, it's hard to talk to friends and family because you don't know what their status is. And so it's hard to talk about money at any point in your life, but it gets more difficult as you age, and it pushes up against your personal and societal expectations of who we should be at that point in our lives. Finally, we found that as more seniors were getting online, they were mostly just checking their bank balances, looking at their grandkids on Facebook. A lot of seniors check the Hudson's Bay Company newsletter, but not doing financial complex transactions like applying for old age security. In spending time with seniors and building relationships and trust, asking about their experience of aging, not just asking them about the thing we wanted to know about old age security, we learned that we were designing not a tech solution, but we were designing to address the shame associated with old age security. The shame that forced seniors not to talk to anyone about their financial circumstances and even recycle unopened envelopes from the CRA that contained critical program information. What they really needed was a human-centered, friendly guide through the program, something discreet, easy to use, and friendly. So after months of trying to unearth this big transformational digital innovation, we realized that what people actually needed was a PDF. We ended up creating a 26-page document that simply educated seniors that old age security is a benefit, it's not welfare, it's a thank you for being Canadian. And in a few minutes, we created, did anyone read Cosmopolitan magazine as a kid or any teen magazine readers? You don't have to put up your hand, that's okay. In a few minutes, you could just trace your finger along a decision tree, not unlike in a teen magazine. What color lipstick should you wear, yes or no? And figure out if you're eligible for old age security. Now, as a designer, and my team of designers, our instinct was to make it cool and digital and interactive, and we were repeatedly told by seniors and social workers not to, as they were just going to print it out in black and white anyways. We learned that we weren't, in fact, serving a digital mandate, but we were addressing the shame and opaqueness of government systems. It was a literacy building exercise, not a digital one. And it takes courage for institutions to solve for something this specific, like solving for shame. But in doing this, we saved millions of dollars that could have otherwise been spent on digital tools. We solved the need quickly, and the solution was out in the world within a year and not held up within the machine of government. We invested in building the right thing once, not a partially effective thing twice. And it left the federal government with the balance of the allocated funds to actually innovate the program of old age security while simultaneously addressing the acute human need. These days, we often find that cities and institutions will jump to technology as a solution instead of understanding the human dynamics underpinning change. Each of the pillars of Brampton 2040 is complex, and it's going to be hard to understand how to bring it to life without spending time deeply with people, quality time with the public on their terms to understand how they feel. It's going to require fundamentally rethinking what engagement looks like and learning how to prioritize storytelling as real, high-quality data. Whether you're working in government or a resident of the city, it's imperative that you collectively advocate for ongoing ways to learn about how people feel, and not just what they say. Solving real human problems, another simple thing that's incredibly difficult. It's key to make sure that the problems that you're actually solving for address a validated need that people have. Too often we solve problems at the civic level that are abstract and focused on efficiency of delivery and outdated assumptions about change. Years ago, when I was faced with a similar question from the City of Toronto, when they had designated a handful of neighborhoods in the city as priority neighborhoods, this was right after, I don't know if any of you remember in 2005, the Summer of the Gun, they had chosen these places at a time where additional investment was needed to mitigate this perceived sense that they were having that there was increased gun violence and youth gang activity in 13 neighborhoods across Toronto. Part of the solution to mitigate that challenge was to develop a public art program where they put public art in orphan spaces, which is the interstitial spaces between buildings, to create more vibrant and ultimately safer places in neighborhoods and communities. The question the city was asking was, how might we inspire disengaged youth in the community through public art? I was assigned a neighborhood in East Scarborough and a local organization that would help facilitate the engagement with the youth. And I found my way out to Kingston Galloway Orton Park, which, as a new Torontonian at the time, this was about 13 years ago, it took me about 2 hours on public transit, and I arrived at the East Scarborough storefront, which was a critical community backbone organization serving the residents of the neighborhood and the surrounding Tower community to the tune of 75,000 visits a year with approximately 6 staff. The kicker in this story is that they were doing all of this amazing work out of this building, which was a repurposed 1960s police substation that had not been converted and had been given to the organization, where homework clubs were happening alongside former jail cells. When getting the tour of the space, the executive director shared that they had recently done a community visioning, and when asking the community what they would do with $1 million, it was really no surprise that they said, well, we would build a new East Scarborough storefront. The community wasn't disengaged, and the youth weren't disengaged. In fact, they were actively looking for a place to run programs, interface with the neighborhood, broaden their reach, and were wanting a dignified and bigger place to do it from. The problem I had to solve for was a high-level, programmatic-focused problem about public art when there was a real human problem to be solved. How might we support the youth in the community to design a place that meets their needs? The youth didn't need us to run an art program or paint a mural between buildings. They needed us to help them understand how to design and build a new East Scarborough storefront, and in doing that, understand how public infrastructure actually gets built. They were organized, they were engaged, they were driven, and they had a strong social infrastructure that was activated and ready to do the work. So the grant that I had received from the city was $30,000. As you can imagine, that's not enough to build a building. But we used it to start running Thursday night sessions, where each week we would introduce the community to the fundamentals of city planning, architecture, finance, fundraising, and sustainable and accessible design. Those sessions ran every Thursday night for 7 years, whether one person or 60 people showed up, whether one person showed up with all their siblings or just one. And in the past 7 years, this community has raised over $2 million, renovated over 4,000 square feet. I'll show you some of the plans. And have patented, the 12 to 21-year-olds in the neighborhood have patented a green building innovation called the Skyoswale that they now hold. So youth from one of the most marginalized neighborhoods in the country now hold the patent for a green building innovation. And they recently submitted this plan to the city that just got approved to renew the East Scarborough storefront. We solved for the real human problem and ultimately extended engagement beyond a one-time thing. We extended into an ongoing, people-powered program that has made community design part of the DNA of that neighborhood. In this place, we broke down the elitism of city building, architecture, and planning, and opened up the definition of who gets to call themselves a city builder. Those young people now in their 20s find themselves at the table as leaders in conservation planning, transportation planning, and as policymakers in place-based poverty reduction. And they're helping their neighborhoods and other neighborhoods like theirs. Every time now I go back to the neighborhood, they go, "What are you doing here?" And the community has really taken ownership of what it means to look at systems-level design of the place that they live. Now, the community knew that the engagement wasn't driven by myself or the organizing group, and that we were just the facilitators of the knowledge. They would tell us what they needed to learn, and we facilitated that learning. They knew that the project was theirs, and if they didn't show up on Thursdays to design it, it just wouldn't happen. As a result, these youth assumed a stewardship that ultimately helped them understand and recognize their own power in transforming the places in which they live. Solving for real human problems helps us to create ideas that radically transform places and share power with people who wouldn't otherwise step into it or even take it for themselves. It distributes decision-making across more people, creating a dynamic process that ultimately lands ownership in the hands of the community. As you go through the process of bringing your vision to life, pay attention to questions that are being asked and ensure that within them there are two things: people and needs. And you'll be surprised how many times you'll see problem frames coming out of institutions that don't have people and needs. In the case of the storefront, in solving for true community need, we met the institutional objectives in an exponentially more impactful and sustained way by handing over power to the neighborhood. Watch out for orthodoxies. I saved the best for last because this is my favorite. This is my most favorite trick for finding opportunities for inclusion and innovation, and I call it flipping orthodoxies. Institutions, communities, and organizations develop sets of habits and rules that shape conventional wisdom over time, and we call these rules orthodoxies. When we flip orthodoxies, we find opportunities for transformative ways to change the world. So here's an example of an orthodoxy that was flipped that was kind of a game changer. So are people in the room familiar with Zipcar? Like Zipcar, car sharing? Right. So you used to have to rent a car at a central location for a whole day. And when you flip the orthodoxy, the car is outside your house and you can rent it by the minute. You transform the way that people experience cars, people experience ownership, and also just the economics of what it means to own a car in a city versus not owning a car in the city. And over the years, I've worked with so many organizations. I've worked with all levels of government as they do these open concept hoteling-based offices. Does anyone work in one of those? In one of those open concept offices? where you have no, yeah, I see some hands sort of like not super enthusiastic about them. And these offices are designed, they're smaller, so that people are encouraged to work more flexibly and work from home. And what they notice is that they design these smaller, cooler, open concept offices, assuming half the office is going to stay home. And everyone shows up at 7 a.m., claims a desk, puts their stuff down. I see people nodding in the audience, run out, go get their breakfast, go work out, and then they come back to the desk they claimed. And no one's working from home. And it's because they didn't interrogate a very important orthodoxy. That if you're not visible, you're not busy, right? For people, they worried that their managers, if they didn't see them for 3 weeks on end, they wouldn't be first in line for the promotion or the great project or the increase in compensation. So for all the money all these institutions and levels of government spent on these fancy, cool, new offices with beanbag chairs, everyone still showed up every day. In the case of the old age security story, the orthodoxy that we were flipping was digital means accessible. Because what we needed in that situation was an analog solution. In the case of the storefront, we flipped only professionals build buildings to enable a group of disengaged, definitely not disengaged youth, to transform their communities. So orthodoxies can help us find really human problems to solve for. And so the trick to finding an orthodoxy is this. When someone says, well, that's just the way things work around here, the thing they are referring to is the orthodoxy. So the next time you hear someone say that, you're allowed to say, Zara said that's an orthodoxy. I'm going to give you an example of a non-city related orthodoxy that I really love about the Toronto Blue Jays. Is there any Toronto Blue Jays fans in here? It's always wavering when I ask that question. People are never confident to put up their hands. Put up your hand. Be a confident Toronto Blue Jays fan. Okay, so this is for some of you. Actually, it's quite a large contingent. So a few years ago, I had the opportunity to collaborate with the Toronto Blue Jays as they were thinking about redesigning the Rogers Centre. And they had done some preliminary market research, and the market research showed that 80% of people who go to Blue Jays games don't go for the baseball. So what do you think they go for? You can just yell it out. Hot dogs. What else do they go for? Beer. I heard hot dogs and beer. Yes, that is why people go to Jays games. And knowing this, we decided to articulate an orthodoxy that baseball, or flip the orthodoxy, baseball is the most important part of the fan experience when we had just learned that it wasn't. People go to see and be seen. They go to socialize. Some people don't even look up from chatting with their friend or texting on their phone or taking pictures. We learned that the Rogers Centre is this thing called a permission space where if you're on a diet, your diet doesn't count. And if you're like a vegetarian, you just eat a hot dog anyways. So it's all very confusing. But we knew that the Jays, being our only Major League Baseball team in Canada, has also one of the most diverse audiences in baseball. And we wanted to think about the redesign in the context of being more accommodating for dynamic fans that wanted to attend games. So we decided to embark on a co-design project alongside with fans to explore the experience of this really expensive food. You spend $20 on a hot dog and a beer that you're treating yourself to. And so we created this simulation. So we had these fans come, and I'll show you a picture of them. I say fans reticently because the two women on either end say they only go to Jays games when someone else buys a ticket, which I think is a lot of us. And then the fella on the side, that's Adam, and he has had seasons tickets since the early 90s. Lucky guy, got to see the World Series run. And beside Adam is Aunt Betty, who has seasons tickets and rides 2 hours on a bus wearing her sparkly Blue Jays earrings to see every single game. Aunt Betty is a gem. And so what we did was in this really simple simulation, we had people go to a vendor and we asked them to just grab some food with both hands, a drink and a hot dog of your choice. And then we had them go and just sit down in a row, just like you would at a game. And when they got to the end of the row and someone was sitting there, what do you think the first thing people did was? What do you think the first thing that came out of their mouth was? Say it louder. Sorry, you got it. You'd get to the end of the row, and I don't want to walk too far away from the mic, but people would go, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, until they got to their seat. And we spend all of this money on food and this really and sort of give people this really undignified state of eating. So, you're trying to, and for those of you who've been to any kind of event like this, you're quickly trying to eat your hot dog so that you have a free hand, and then you want to put the wrapper down, but you don't want to step in cheese, and you don't want to step on someone's nice purse. And so you're kind of negotiating all these things while you're doing the one thing you came there to do, which is eat this not so great for you food that is, calorie free within the Rogers Center. And so what we realized was that we weren't even doing that one thing that we needed to do very well. And Aunt Betty pointed out that it's a funny story if you're like me and you're short and fairly small and able-bodied. But if you're not and you don't have your full physical abilities, it can be embarrassing and humiliating, and you feel like you're worried about wrecking people's stuff. And so it's not like a funny, jokey experience. It's actually really, really humiliating. And so we came up with this idea of a flex seating area with tables and padded ground so that kids could crawl around and you could eat your food in this really dignified way. And we tried to figure out how we were going to rotate people in and out of this area because it couldn't be the whole stadium. And it pointed us to another orthodoxy, that you have to buy a ticket for the whole game. Isn't that crazy that well, maybe I'm just not a huge sports fan, but I think it's crazy that you have to buy a ticket for the whole game. So what if you were allowed to load up, do we have Presto here in Brampton? Presto cards? Yeah, okay. So yeah, someone just put out their hand, I have a Presto card. If we were allowed to load up a Presto card, let's say with 18 innings, which is 2 games, I know enough about baseball to know that, and people could come at the end of a workday with their kids or their friends, they could tap into the stadium, they could go to the flex area, eat dinner with their families, and when they're done and their kids are tired, they throw them over their shoulder and they tap out, and they still have a whole bunch of innings left. They still have 16 innings left on their Presto card, which extends the cost of 2 games over an entire season. It would allow 80% of the people who come to a game to hang out more comfortably, be more economically, and it would create space for families and people who have accessibility issues and help them to enjoy the treats they have come to the stadium for in a more joyful way. In flipping this orthodoxy, we go beyond transforming the experience of the game, but we also create a new economic model for sports and baseball, making games much more affordable for families, not leaving them to only buy season's tickets. So flipping orthodoxies can be this really transformative way to uncover change. And moving forward, I'd love to propose one for us to collectively reflect on as we think about Brampton 2040. We've come to accept the orthodoxy that engaging with government is serious, effortful, time-consuming, and static. I suggest that we explore what happens when we flip this and design for a world where engaging with government is delightful, flowing, right-sized for each of our lives, maybe even fun. What if engaging with government was amongst the most delightful experience in our lives? Don't giggle, that's what you're here for. Instead of rebuilding cooler consultation processes, let's flip the convention and build a relational experience rather than a transactional one. You've already started that out with the year-long engagement for Brampton 2040 from what I've heard and read and geeked out about online. But the real challenge begins now. How do you keep doing this? And so designing for a deeper relationship and better connection between the public and government is a very different design brief than designing consultation processes and project-based engagement. The most powerful relationships in our lives are ones that span the landscape of joy to pain, excitement to frustration, love to loss, and they take time and persistence to nurture. But it is in these relationships that we take risks. We learn, we grow, and our real relationships build our connections with each other and leave us with an ongoing and maybe even joyful way to advance our civic dialogue, our cities, and our democracy. So this is my challenge to you today. Work together with each other and your amazing local government to build a new relationship, not just an engagement process that will help you bring Brampton 2040 to life, and use these tactics I've shared with you to help along the way. So I'd like to end as we began, talking about you and your lives and your lived experiences, making each of you a really great city builder. I hope all hands would go up if I asked the question again. My work picks up on where one of my greatest influences, Jane Jacobs, left off. She wasn't a planner or an economist, but has served as one of the most influential thinkers in both of those spaces. She wanted it to be valued that lived experience has power, that you don't need to be an expert to make change happen, just a willingness to see that change happens in many different ways. I believe that every time we use a more human-centered approach to learning about life in cities, we're making that change. In the last line of her seminal book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, she so poignantly states that lively, diverse, intense cities contain the seeds of their own regeneration, with energy enough to carry over from the problems and needs outside of themselves. I believe that when we invest in diversifying who gets to participate in solving wicked problems, we too start planting the seeds of our own regeneration. We diversify the types of experiences, ideas, expertise, and approaches that give us a better shot at building solutions that stick and resilient cities that can adapt as the world changes and evolves. And I understand that getting to the proverbial table, and sometimes the actual table of engagement, is hard enough with the barriers of our lives and our identities, sometimes making it hard to be there and to be fully engaged. I also really know what it feels like to be new to these spaces, these city building spaces, which sometimes makes it hard to interrogate and ask why. Why are we doing it that way when you feel like you're just a renter, you're just a student, you're just a mom. I even heard someone say that, I'm just a coordinator. And I invite you to reflect on the fact that an inclusive city can only become a reality when all of those experiences are recognized, honored, and included consistently in decisions that are made for the city's future. So to do this, we need you all to show up, give your lived experience some power, be advocates for human-centered urbanism, and trust that your unique lived experience is the best credential you'll ever have. Thank you.
saying that you never give up. You keep fighting for social change. You don't stop. And if, in fact, the United Nations has in various places failed, then you confront them with that failure and you try to change.